Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for more than a decade, encountering countless families and hearing numerous touching stories. But on a quiet November afternoon in 2024, he was about to witness something that would reduce his studio to absolute silence and leave every person present struggling to maintain their composure. The atmosphere carried the typical energy one expects at a game show taping, with two families positioned on stage ready to compete. Cameras recording what everyone anticipated would be another entertaining episode filled with laughter and perhaps a few heartwarming family moments. What nobody could have predicted was that a 91-year-old grandmother was about to share her late husband's final written words, a letter so profound and unexpected that it would transcend the boundaries of entertainment and become instead a moment of raw human truth that would touch millions of lives. Before we proceed further with this extraordinary account, if you value stories that remind us what truly matters in life and the power of love that endures beyond death, please take a moment to press the like button and subscribe to our channel. Because what you are about to experience represents one of the most powerful testimonies to enduring love and final wisdom ever captured on television. The Patterson family from Virginia stood on one side of the stage, their coordinated navy blue shirts bearing their family name, their expressions reflecting enthusiasm and readiness for the competition ahead. On the opposite side stood the Anderson family from Minnesota, equally prepared and displaying the kind of multi-generational unity that makes Family Feud such compelling television. Among the Anderson family members stood someone who immediately commanded attention through sheer presence and the unmistakable dignity that can only come from 9 decades of lived experience. Dorothy Anderson was 91 years old, standing with the aid of an elegant wooden cane that had belonged to her late husband, her silver hair styled in soft waves that framed a face marked by time but animated by eyes that still sparkled with intelligence and warmth. She wore a lavender dress that her granddaughter had helped her select for this special occasion, and around her neck hung a simple gold locket that she touched occasionally, an unconscious gesture that spoke of habit and remembered love. Dorothy had been born in 1933 in a small Minnesota farming community where life revolved around the rhythms of planting and harvest, where neighbors knew each other's business and looked after one another through good times and hardships alike. She had grown up during the Great Depression and World War II, formative experiences that had shaped her understanding of sacrifice, resilience, and the importance of community and family bonds that could weather any storm. Her parents had operated a small dairy farm, working from dawn until past dark, to provide for their 6 children, instilling in all of them a strong work ethic and an appreciation for simple blessings. Dorothy had been a bright student despite the limited educational resources available in rural Minnesota during the 1940s, and she had harbored dreams of becoming a teacher. Though the financial realities of her family situation made college seem an impossible aspiration. She had graduated from high school in 1951 and taken a job as a clerk at the local general store, contributing her wages to help support her younger siblings, and resigned to the likelihood that her dreams of higher education would remain unfulfilled. Everything changed when Dorothy met William Anderson in the summer of 1952. William had just returned from serving in the Korean War, carrying both the visible scars of combat and the invisible wounds that would trouble him for years to come. He had taken a job at the grain elevator in town, working hard to rebuild a civilian life after the trauma of military service. He was a quiet man, thoughtful and serious, not given to unnecessary words, but possessing a depth of character that became apparent to anyone who took the time to know him. Dorothy first encountered William when he came into the general store to purchase work supplies, and she had been struck by the sadness in his eyes and the careful way he moved, as though he was still expecting danger around every corner. She had made a point of being kind to him, offering a warm greeting whenever he entered the store and gradually drawing him into brief conversations that seemed to ease something in his troubled spirit. Over the course of that summer, their interactions grew longer and more personal, and William began to look forward to his trips to the general store, not for the supplies he needed, but for the few minutes of conversation with the young woman whose warmth and genuine interest made him feel human again after the dehumanizing experiences of war. By autumn of 1952, William had worked up the courage to ask Dorothy if she would accompany him to a church social, and she had accepted immediately, sensing in this wounded young veteran someone worth knowing, someone whose quietness concealed depths of feeling and strength of character. Their courtship unfolded slowly and carefully, with William gradually opening up about his experiences in Korea and the nightmares that still plagued him, and Dorothy listening without judgment, offering comfort and understanding that helped him process trauma he had not known how to articulate. They married in June of 1953 in a simple ceremony at the community church, beginning a partnership that would span more than 70 years and weather every challenge that life presented. William proved to be exactly the kind of husband Dorothy needed, steady and devoted, working tirelessly to provide for their growing family while supporting her dreams in every way he could. When Dorothy expressed her old longing to become a teacher, William had worked extra shifts at the grain elevator and encouraged her to enroll in the local community college, caring for their infant daughter during evening hours while Dorothy attended classes. It took her 6 years of part-time study, but Dorothy earned her teaching certificate in 1959, and she spent the next 35 years teaching elementary school children, shaping young minds and touching hundreds of lives, while William continued his work at the grain elevator and later as a supervisor at an agricultural supply company. Together, they raised 4 children on modest but sufficient wages, creating a home environment marked by love, respect, and the quiet demonstration of values lived rather than merely preached. William never spoke much about his war experiences beyond what he had shared with Dorothy during their courtship, preferring to focus on the present and the family they were building rather than dwelling on past trauma. He was a devoted father who attended every school play and sporting event, who helped with homework and taught his children practical skills, who demonstrated through daily actions what it meant to be reliable, honest, and kind. He was an active member of their church community, serving on various committees and always willing to help with maintenance projects or community service initiatives. He and Dorothy built a life together that their children and later their grandchildren would remember as stable, loving, and grounded in principles that seemed increasingly rare as the decades passed. William had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer at age 88, a devastating blow that came with little warning and a prognosis that offered limited hope for treatment or recovery. The cancer had been aggressive and advanced by the time of diagnosis, and the doctors had given him perhaps 6 months to live. William had faced this news with the same quiet courage he had displayed throughout his life, refusing to waste his remaining time in anger or despair, choosing instead to focus on ensuring that Dorothy and their family would be cared for after his death. He had spent those final months putting his affairs in order, having difficult but necessary conversations with each of his children about practical matters and expressing his love and pride in the people they had become. He had spent hours with his grandchildren, sharing stories and wisdom, creating final memories that they would carry with them long after he was gone. But there was something else William had done during those final months, something that Dorothy discovered only after his death, something that would ultimately lead to this moment on the Family Feud stage. William had written letters, multiple letters addressed to Dorothy, but with instructions that they be delivered at specific times and circumstances after his death. He had given these sealed envelopes to their oldest son with detailed instructions about when each should be given to Dorothy. The first letter was to be delivered on the day of his funeral. The second was to be given to her on what would have been their next wedding anniversary. The third was to be opened on her next birthday. Each letter had contained words of love, encouragement, memories, and wisdom, helping Dorothy navigate the profound grief of losing her partner of 70 years. The letters had been a lifeline during the darkest days after William's death, tangible evidence that his love continued, even though his physical presence was gone. Dorothy had treasured each letter, reading and rereading them until she had memorized every word, finding comfort in seeing William's handwriting and hearing his voice in the carefully chosen phrases. But there had been one final letter, one that William had specified should only be delivered under particular circumstances, and those circumstances had only recently materialized. William's instructions had stated that this last letter should be given to Dorothy if and when she found herself in a situation where she was doing something significant with their entire family, something that would create a shared experience and happy memories that the whole family could celebrate together. Their son had carried this sealed envelope for 3 years since William's death, waiting for the right moment, uncertain whether such a moment would ever arrive, given Dorothy's advanced age and declining mobility. Then Dorothy's granddaughter had suggested applying for Family Feud as a way to create a fun family experience that would involve multiple generations, something Dorothy had always talked about enjoying when she watched the show in the evenings. The family had applied, been selected, and made plans to travel to the studio as a group that included Dorothy, 3 of her 4 children, 4 grandchildren, and even 2 great-grandchildren who came along to watch even though they were too young to compete. The night before the taping, Dorothy's son had given her the final letter, explaining that this Family Feud appearance with the whole family together seemed to perfectly match the circumstances William had described. Dorothy had taken the envelope with trembling hands, seeing William's familiar handwriting on the outside, the simple words written in his careful script stating, "To my darling Dorothy, for when you are creating new memories with our family." She had been tempted to open it immediately, but something had stopped her. A sense that this letter was meant to be read at a particular moment. That William, in his wisdom, had understood something about timing and impact that she should trust, even though she did not yet understand it. She had placed the unopened letter in her purse, bringing it with her to the studio, carrying it as a talisman and a connection to the man she still missed, with an intensity that had not diminished despite 3 years of his absence. Now standing on the Family Feud stage under bright studio lights with cameras recording and an audience watching, Dorothy felt the weight of that letter in her purse and wondered whether this was the moment William had anticipated, whether there was some reason he had wanted her to have his final words in this particular setting. Steve Harvey began his customary introduction of the families, bringing his characteristic warmth and humor to the proceedings, clearly delighted by the multi-generational nature of both competing families. When he reached Dorothy, Steve paused with obvious respect and gentle concern, taking in the elderly woman who was by far the oldest contestant he had hosted in quite some time. He asked Dorothy her age, and when she replied that she was 91, the audience responded with enthusiastic applause, and several people called out words of encouragement and admiration. Steve commented on how wonderful it was to see someone of Dorothy's age looking so vibrant and engaged, and he asked her what brought her to Family Feud at this stage of her life. Dorothy smiled, her voice clear despite her age as she explained that her late husband William had loved watching Family Feud, that they had watched it together nearly every evening for years, and that after his death 3 years ago, she had continued watching as a way of feeling connected to him and to the memories they had created during those quiet evening hours together. She said that her family had suggested coming on the show as a way to create a new happy memory, something William would have enjoyed watching them do, and that she had agreed because at 91 years old, she had learned that you should never pass up an opportunity to spend time with the people you love doing something that brings joy. Steve's expression softened with compassion, and he expressed his condolences for her loss, while also praising her attitude toward life and family. He asked her what the secret to a long marriage was, and Dorothy's answer was simple and direct, stating that the secret was choosing love every single day, even when it was difficult, respecting each other's differences, and never going to bed angry no matter how upset you might be about a disagreement. The game began, and both families competed with enthusiasm and good humor. Dorothy participated when it was her turn, displaying a sharpness of mind that belied her advanced age and earning points for her family, with answers that showed both wisdom and an understanding of how other people thought. Her family members kept glancing at her with obvious pride and affection, clearly thrilled to be sharing this experience with their beloved matriarch. The competition was close and engaging, with both families performing well and the lead changing several times throughout the various rounds. The Anderson family ultimately prevailed in the main game by accumulating more total points, and they advanced to the fast money round for an opportunity to win the $20,000 grand prize. Dorothy's granddaughter volunteered to go first, handling the rapid-fire questions with composure and scoring 146 points. A strong performance that meant the second family member needed only 54 points to reach the 200-point threshold and secure the prize money. The family began discussing who should take the second position, and Dorothy surprised everyone by stating quietly but firmly that she wished to do it, that she wanted to contribute to their victory if possible, that at 91 she had learned not to wait for tomorrow to do things that mattered to you today. Her children looked uncertain, worried that the pressure might be overwhelming for their elderly mother, but Dorothy's expression made clear that this was important to her in ways they might not fully understand. They deferred to her wishes, and Dorothy made her way to the fast money podium with measured steps, her cane tapping softly against the stage floor, her bearing dignified despite her obvious physical fragility. Steve Harvey approached Dorothy with a mixture of admiration and concern, asking if she was certain she wanted to take on this challenge and gently reminding her that the fast money round required quick thinking and rapid responses. Dorothy looked at Steve with those clear, intelligent eyes and told him she was quite certain that she had been answering these questions from her living room sofa for years, and she thought it was time to see if she could do it under pressure. Steve smiled and nodded, recognizing the determination in the elderly woman before him, and he announced that 20 seconds would go on the clock. The questions came in rapid succession. Steve asked Dorothy to name something people put on a hot dog. Mustard, she answered immediately. He asked her to name a month when people go on vacation. July, she responded without hesitation. He asked what time children typically go to bed on a school night. 8 o'clock, Dorothy said clearly. He asked her to name a type of flower you might give someone. Roses. Finally, he asked her to name something people do when they first wake up in the morning. Stretch, Dorothy answered, just as the buzzer sounded. The audience applauded enthusiastically, impressed by how smoothly the 91-year-old woman had handled the pressure and pace of fast money. Steve began revealing the results with his characteristic showmanship, building tension with each answer. Mustard for something people put on a hot dog showed as the number one answer, earning 39 points. The family was excited. July as a vacation month came up as the number one answer, adding 42 points. 8 o'clock for children's bedtime was revealed as the number 2 answer, contributing 31 points. Roses for a type of flower showed as the number 1 answer, adding 37 points. The Anderson family was now certain they had won, and the studio was filled with excited energy. The final answer, stretch for something people do when waking up, was revealed as the number 2 answer with 28 points. Dorothy had scored 177 points in her fast money round, bringing the family's combined total to 323 points. The Anderson family had won decisively, and the studio erupted in celebration. Steve Harvey stood looking at Dorothy with genuine amazement and delight, clearly moved by what the 91-year-old grandmother had just accomplished. The audience gave her a sustained standing ovation, and her family surrounded her with embraces and congratulations, several of them crying with joy and pride. Steve approached Dorothy and told her that what she had just done was remarkable, that he had hosted countless fast money rounds, but that watching a 91-year-old grandmother perform under pressure with such skill and confidence was one of the highlights of his entire hosting career. Dorothy smiled and thanked him, but then her expression shifted to something more serious, more purposeful. She reached into her purse with a slightly trembling hand and withdrew the envelope she had been carrying, the final letter from William that she had not yet opened. She looked at Steve and told him that her late husband had left her several letters to be opened at specific times after his death, and that this final letter had been meant for a moment when she was creating new memories with her whole family. She said that she believed this was that moment, that William somehow had anticipated this, and that she wanted to open and read the letter now, here on this stage, with her family present and with Steve and the audience as witnesses. She asked Steve if that would be acceptable, if he would permit her to share something deeply personal in this very public setting, explaining that she felt compelled to honor William's intention that this letter be part of a shared family experience rather than a private moment. Steve looked at Dorothy with an expression that blended surprise, respect, and intuitive understanding that something significant was about to occur. He told Dorothy that of course she could share her husband's letter, that he would be honored to be present for such a moment, and that everyone there understood they were witnessing something far more important than a game show. The studio fell silent as Dorothy carefully opened the envelope with fingers that had begun to tremble noticeably. She withdrew several pages of paper covered in William's distinctive handwriting, and she took a moment to steady herself, touching the locket at her throat as if drawing strength from the physical reminder of her husband's presence in her life. Then she began to read aloud, her voice initially soft but growing stronger as she progressed through William's final written words. William had begun the letter with an expression of love, telling Dorothy that if she was reading these words, it meant she had found the courage to continue living and creating joy even after his death, and that this knowledge brought him peace even as he wrote from his hospice bed, knowing his time was limited. He told her how proud he was of the life they had built together, of the children they had raised, and the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward their values and their legacy. But then William's letter shifted to something unexpected, something that would explain why he had wanted these words shared in a public family setting rather than read in private. William wrote that he needed to tell Dorothy a truth he had carried for more than 70 years, a secret he had kept not out of shame, but out of a desire to protect her from pain, but that he now understood she deserved to know before his death created a permanent barrier to honesty between them. He wrote that during his service in Korea, he had been part of a unit that had committed an atrocity, that in the chaos and fear of combat, his fellow soldiers had killed civilians in a village, women and children who had posed no threat, innocent people murdered in a moment of panic and rage that William had witnessed but had been powerless to stop as the youngest and lowest-ranking member of his squad. He wrote that he had reported what happened to his commanding officer, but that the incident had been covered up, classified as enemy casualties, and that the soldiers responsible had faced no consequences, while William had been warned to keep silent or face retaliation. William wrote that this experience had broken something in him, that he had carried guilt and grief over those innocent deaths for his entire life, that the nightmares Dorothy had helped him through during their early years together had been about those murdered civilians, rather than combat against enemy soldiers. He wrote that he had never spoken of this because he feared she would see him differently, would lose respect for him even though he had not pulled the trigger, would question whether he should have done more to stop what happened or to ensure justice was served afterward. He wrote that his silence had been an act of cowardice disguised as protection, and that he regretted deeply never trusting her with this truth during the decades they had together. He wrote that he was telling her now, in this letter meant to be read in the presence of their family, because he wanted his children and grandchildren to understand something important about integrity, courage, and the cost of silence in the face of injustice. William wrote that he had spent 70 years carrying the weight of what he witnessed, and that this burden had shaped every choice he made, every value he embraced, every action he took in his civilian life. He wrote that his devotion to family, his commitment to community service, his insistence on honesty and ethical behavior in all dealings, his support for Dorothy's teaching career so she could shape young minds toward justice and compassion, all of these things had been his attempt to create enough good in the world to somehow balance the evil he had witnessed and failed to prevent. He wrote that he knew this was impossible, that no amount of good deeds could bring back the innocent people who died in that Korean village, but that trying to live a life of integrity and service had been his way of honoring their memory and refusing to let their deaths be completely meaningless. He wrote that he wanted his family to know this truth because secrets, even those kept with good intentions, create distance and dishonesty that diminish us, and because he wanted them to understand that moral courage sometimes means speaking difficult truths even when doing so is frightening and potentially costly. William wrote that he hoped Dorothy could forgive him for keeping this secret for so long, for not trusting her with his deepest pain and guilt, for allowing fear to prevent the complete honesty that their marriage deserved. He wrote that he hoped his children and grandchildren would learn from his mistake, would understand that silence in the face of injustice, even when that silence seems prudent or necessary, comes with a cost to one's soul that compounds over time. He wrote that if he could live his life over, he would have spoken publicly about what happened in Korea regardless of the consequences, would have insisted on accountability and justice for those innocent victims, would have refused to let fear and institutional pressure silence his conscience. He wrote that he was sharing this truth now, even after his death, because it was never too late to speak honestly, and because the example of finally telling the truth might help someone else find the courage to speak their own difficult truths rather than carrying them in silence for a lifetime. William concluded the letter by returning to his love for Dorothy, telling her that she had been the greatest blessing of his life, that her love and partnership had given him strength and purpose during the decades when guilt and grief might otherwise have destroyed him, and that he hoped she would continue to live fully and joyfully after his death, creating new memories with their family and never allowing loss to diminish her engagement with life. He told her that he would be watching over her from wherever consciousness goes after death, cheering her on, celebrating her victories, and loving her as completely as he had loved her during their 70 years of marriage. He signed the letter simply, "Your William, forever and always." Dorothy finished reading and looked up from the pages, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking as she held William's final written words. The studio was completely silent, every person present stunned by the profound revelation they had just witnessed. Steve Harvey stood motionless, his eyes glistening with tears, his mouth slightly open as if he wanted to speak, but could not find words adequate to the moment. Dorothy's children and grandchildren stood frozen, clearly struggling to process what their father and grandfather had just revealed. The secret burden he had carried for 7 decades, finally exposed in the most public possible way. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. The weight of William's confession settling over everyone present like a physical presence. When Steve finally found his voice, it emerged rough and unsteady, barely above a whisper. He told Dorothy that what she had just shared was one of the most courageous and profound things he had ever witnessed, that William's honesty, even after death, demonstrated a level of integrity and moral courage that was increasingly rare, and that the lesson embedded in his confession about the cost of silence and the necessity of speaking truth was something everyone present needed to hear and absorb. Steve turned to address the cameras directly, his voice growing stronger as he spoke to the audience watching at home. He said that what had just occurred transcended entertainment and game shows, that they had all witnessed a moment of raw truth and moral reckoning that challenged everyone to examine their own silences, their own failures to speak up in the face of injustice, their own secrets kept out of fear rather than wisdom. Steve turned back to Dorothy and asked her how she felt hearing this revelation after 70 years of marriage, after 3 years of widowhood, after building a life with a man who had carried such a heavy secret throughout their partnership. Dorothy took a moment to compose herself, wiping tears from her face with a tissue her granddaughter handed her. She said that her first emotion was not anger or betrayal, but rather overwhelming sadness that William had carried this burden alone for so long, that he had not trusted her enough to share it during their decades together, when she might have helped him process the guilt and grief. She said her second emotion was pride, that even after his death, William had found the courage to speak his truth and to use his confession as a teaching moment for their family and for anyone else who might hear his words. She said that William had always been a man of deep integrity, who struggled with moral questions most people never had to face, and that his decision to finally speak the truth, even posthumously, was entirely consistent with the man she had known and loved. Dorothy said something else that would resonate with everyone who heard it. She explained that William's letter had revealed not just his secret, but also the reason behind so many of his choices and behaviors throughout their marriage, things she had never fully understood but had accepted because she trusted him. She said that his insistence on always doing the right thing even when it was costly, his support for her teaching, career because education could shape young people toward justice and compassion, his quiet involvement in veterans' organizations where he counseled younger veterans about processing trauma and maintaining moral courage, his regular donations to international humanitarian organizations that worked in conflict zones. All of these things now made complete sense as expressions of his attempt to create good in the world, as a counterweight to the evil he had witnessed. She said that understanding the source of his choices did not change her love for him or her respect for the life he had lived, but rather deepened her appreciation for how hard he had worked to be a good man, despite carrying such a heavy burden. Then Dorothy addressed her children and grandchildren directly, still standing on the stage but turning to face them as she spoke. She told them that William's letter was a gift, not just to her but to all of them, because it taught a lesson about integrity, courage, and the importance of speaking truth that would serve them well throughout their lives. She said that William had made a mistake in keeping silent for so long, but that his final act of honesty redeemed that mistake and provided an example they should all follow. She told them that they would face moments in their own lives when speaking the truth would be difficult or frightening, when staying silent would seem easier or safer, and that in those moments they should remember their grandfather's confession and his stated regret about not speaking sooner. She said that moral courage was not about being perfect or never making mistakes, but about being willing to acknowledge those mistakes and to learn from them even when doing so was painful or costly. Steve Harvey, recovered somewhat from the initial shock of William's revelation, asked Dorothy what she planned to do with the knowledge William had shared in his letter. Dorothy's answer demonstrated the same strength and clarity of purpose that had characterized her entire life. She said that she intended to honor William's final wishes by ensuring his confession served a purpose beyond personal catharsis. She explained that she would reach out to military veterans organizations and offer to share William's letter as part of programs addressing moral injury, the psychological and spiritual damage that occurs when people participate in or witness actions that violate their deeply held moral beliefs. She said that many veterans carried similar burdens of guilt over things they had witnessed or been forced to participate in during combat, and that William's willingness to finally speak his truth might help others find the courage to seek help and healing, rather than suffering in silence. She said that she would also work to ensure that the historical record of the Korean War included acknowledgement of civilian casualties and atrocities that had been covered up, so that the innocent people who died in that village William mentioned would not be completely forgotten or erased from history. Furthermore, Dorothy announced that she would be donating the $20,000 the family had won on Family Feud to organizations that documented war crimes and supported victims of military violence, explaining that this seemed the most appropriate way to honor both William's confession and his lifetime of attempting to create good in response to the evil he had witnessed. Steve Harvey, moved by Dorothy's response, immediately announced that he would personally match her donation, doubling the contribution to $40,000 and helping to ensure that William's final act of honesty would have concrete positive impact in the world. The audience erupted in applause, many people openly crying at the emotional weight of what they had witnessed, and the grace with which Dorothy had received and responded to her husband's posthumous confession. The episode aired 6 weeks later, and the response was immediate, overwhelming, and more complex than the typical reaction to even the most touching Family Feud moments. Veterans organizations contacted the show requesting copies of William's letter and permission to use it in their counseling and support programs. Mental health professionals who worked with military personnel praised William's confession as an important example of moral injury and the long-term psychological cost of witnessing atrocities. Human rights organizations expressed interest in investigating the incident William described, hoping to identify the village and the victims so that proper acknowledgement and memorial could be provided. Some viewers criticized William for not speaking up sooner, arguing that his silence had been complicit and that posthumous confession did not absolve him of responsibility for failing to pursue justice during his lifetime. Others defended William, pointing out that military personnel who report misconduct often face retaliation and that expecting a young enlisted soldier to challenge his superiors in the 1950s ignored the realities of military hierarchy and culture. The public conversation sparked by William's letter extended far beyond Family Feud and even beyond questions of military conduct. His confession prompted broader discussions about the nature of moral courage, the costs of silence in the face of injustice, the possibility of redemption through belated honesty, and the complex ways that trauma and guilt shape lives over decades. Ethicists and philosophers wrote essays analyzing William's choices and his final decision to confess. Journalists investigated historical records trying to verify and contextualize the incident he described. Religious leaders used William's story in sermons about confession, forgiveness, and the redemptive power of truth. Therapists shared his letter with clients struggling with their own secrets and moral injuries, using William's example to illustrate that it was never too late to speak honestly and seek healing. Dorothy herself became an unexpected advocate for veterans dealing with moral injury and for greater accountability regarding military misconduct. At 91 years old, she began speaking at veterans organizations, universities, and community events, sharing William's letter and discussing the lifetime impact of witnessing atrocities and the importance of creating support systems that allow military personnel to process difficult experiences and moral conflicts. She established a scholarship fund in William's name for students studying conflict resolution, international humanitarian law, and veterans' mental health services. She worked with researchers and journalists who were investigating the Korean War incident William described, providing what information she had and encouraging them to pursue the full truth, regardless of how long ago the events occurred. She corresponded with veterans and family members who reached out after seeing the Family Feud episode, offering understanding and encouragement to those struggling with their own heavy burdens of guilt and silence. 18 months after the Family Feud appearance, researchers were able to identify the likely village where the incident William described had occurred, and the South Korean government arranged for a memorial to be erected, acknowledging the civilian deaths and honoring the innocent victims. Dorothy traveled to South Korea for the dedication ceremony, bringing with her several of her children and grandchildren so that they could bear witness to this act of recognition and remembrance that William's confession had helped make possible. At the ceremony, she read portions of William's letter, his words translated into Korean so that the families of the victims could understand that at least one American soldier had been troubled by what happened and had carried grief and regret for those deaths throughout his long life. The ceremony was emotional and complex, with some family members expressing anger that justice had been so long delayed and others expressing gratitude that the truth was finally being acknowledged. Dorothy stood with quiet dignity throughout, accepting both the anger and the gratitude as appropriate responses to a profound wrong that could never be fully redressed, but that deserved honest acknowledgement. 2 years after the Family Feud appearance, Dorothy passed away peacefully at age 93, surrounded by her family in the same home she had shared with William for so many decades. At her funeral, her children shared stories about both Dorothy and William, speaking honestly about the complexity of their grandfather's confession and the grace with which their grandmother had received and honored it. They read portions of William's final letter, explaining how it had changed their understanding of their family history and had challenged them all to think more deeply about integrity, courage, and the importance of speaking truth, even when doing so was difficult. They announced that Dorothy had left instructions for her own final letter to be read at the funeral, and in that letter she expressed gratitude for her long life, love for her family, and satisfaction that William's confession had ultimately served a purpose beyond personal catharsis, helping other veterans find healing and ensuring that innocent victims of war received acknowledgement and remembrance. The story of Dorothy and William Anderson became a case study in multiple academic disciplines. Military historians used it to discuss the prevalence of unreported atrocities and the institutional pressures that discouraged accountability. Psychologists referenced it when teaching about moral injury and the long-term effects of witnessing trauma. Ethics professors assigned William's letter as required reading for courses on moral courage and the costs of silence. Journalism schools used the media coverage of Dorothy's Family Feud appearance as an example of how entertainment platforms could sometimes become vehicles for important social conversations. And countless ordinary people who watched that episode or read about it found themselves reflecting on their own lives, their own silences, their own failures to speak up when they witnessed injustice, and their own opportunities to demonstrate the kind of belated but genuine moral courage that William had shown in his final letter. If this story of an elderly woman receiving her husband's final confession on national television and responding with grace, wisdom, and a commitment to ensuring his honesty served a larger purpose, has moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with veterans in your life, with family members who carry heavy burdens, and with anyone who needs to understand that it is never too late to speak the truth, and that honesty, even when delayed, can still create meaning and positive change. William Anderson taught us that moral injury is real, that witnessing injustice without being able to prevent it causes genuine psychological and spiritual damage that can last a lifetime, but that speaking the truth, even decades later, can begin a process of healing and accountability. Dorothy taught us that receiving difficult truths with grace and using them constructively rather than allowing them to create bitterness or division is itself a form of courage and strength. Together, they demonstrated that long marriages contain depths and complexities that may not be fully revealed until after death, and that true partnership means honoring each other's struggles and choices even when we might wish those choices had been different. Most importantly, this story challenges all of us to examine our own silences, our own failures to speak up when we witness wrongdoing, and our own opportunities to demonstrate moral courage by telling difficult truths regardless of how much time has passed since the events in question occurred. Thank you for witnessing this remarkable story of love, confession, and the enduring power of truth finally spoken.